morning and a good and Erev Shabbos to you, my holy sisters and brothers. Great to be learning with you on a Friday, Yom Shishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Friday? Renee in Indiana, Joe in the Inland Empire, Gordo in Scotland, Tom in PA, Yehud in South Carolina, Shender in the Bronx, Karen in Northern California, Gordo was in Scotland with a yellow ribbon, Maine, free the hostages, Marjorie in Georgia, Ella in Southern California, also on YouTube, and Mickey in New Jersey. Welcome, everybody. These dafs are meaty and lengthy, so I want to just keep moving and get right into it. Our daf today is page 41 here in Tractate Sanhedrin, 24th volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 in chapter 5. As I mentioned yesterday, traveling, leaving after Shabbos ends tomorrow night, so no class tomorrow night, nor Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Apologies for that, but we will resume after today on Wednesday at the regular time. Yes, we're running a few pages behind in Bava Basra. It was so much easier to catch up because they were short davs. Here, not so much, but eventually we'll get ourselves back on the schedule. Stay with me. Okay. We pick this up at the bottom of page 40b. Ula says, from where in the Torah is the obligation of forewarning derived, right? So in capital cases, corporal cases, cases of execution, court-ordered execution, or lashes, the court's not going to impose that punishment unless the defendant was warned that what he's doing or she's doing violates the law and could subject them to execution or lashes. They need to be warned, and they need to have that warning. They need to register that acknowledge that they were warned, and then do the crime quickly after receiving the warning. This is one of those many safeguards that leads the death penalty to be a rare thing indeed from a Beis Din, from a rabbinic court, from a Sanhedrin in a capital case, 23 judges. But there's a little bit more nuance to that. I mean, you would think like, okay, so in other words, if there weren't two witnesses there that said, hey, if you kill that guy, you're going to be executed for it. And he says, I know, and I'm going to kill him anyway. And then he does it. Unless those conditions are met, this villain, this murderer is never going to be punished. Not so fast. But we're not going to all of the nuances of that yet. Right now, we're just doing some of the aspects of the forewarning requirement. So let's keep going here. From where in the Torah is the obligation of forewarning derived? As it is stated, and if a man shall take his sister, his father's daughter, or his mother's daughter, and see her nakedness, and she see his nakedness, it is a disgraceful deed, and they shall be cut off in the sight of their people. Leviticus 20:17. Now, what are we talking about here? Incest, okay? A brother and sister, even a half-brother and sister having sexual relations. This is incest. It is prohibited by the Torah. Is it a death penalty offense? Not court-ordered execution. This is the punishment of kares, somebody who will be excised. What does that mean? We've seen several times in our journey through the Talmud that the sages themselves disagree on what kares means. Some say it means this person will die a premature death. Some says it means that their children will die a premature death. Some says they will be barren. Others say in the next world, their soul will lose their place in the world to come. So there's some disagreement on what kares is, but definitely you don't want it. Okay. Now, kares is not something that is tried in an earthly court. You don't go to trial in an earthly court for kares. Heaven takes care of this punishment. What does it have to do with forewarning? Let's keep reading. One can ask, is that to say that the matter is dependent on sight? Right? It said that a brother shall not see his sister's nakedness and vice versa. I said it was incest. What are we talking about? Is that to say that the matter is dependent on sight? The transgression is engaging in sexual intercourse, not seeing each other. So rather, the meaning of and see is that he is not liable until he sees the reason of the matter. That it should be clear to him that he is committing a transgression by having been forewarned. Now, if this law is not needed for the matter of charis, right, here translated as excision, as this punishment is in the hands of heaven, and God is aware whether or not he acted intentionally, so then we're going to learn out from this, we apply it to the matter of lashes, as forewarning is required for the court to be able to administer lashes, right? The court will flog somebody who violates a prohibition in the Torah if he does it intentionally. Now we're on page 41a. The school and was warned. Right? Now the school of Chizkiah taught a source for the requirement of forewarning from the verse concerning the court-imposed capital punishment meted out to a murderer. Not trial in the heavenly court, trial in an earthly court for a murderer. As it states, quote, "But if a man come intentionally upon his neighbor to slay him with guile," right? So we're distinguishing the intentional murderer from the manslaughterer who is committed a negligent homicide, and also distinguishing, of course, from an accidental killing. This is an intentional murderer. And the Torah defines that as someone who came intentionally to slay him with guile, right? It sounds like intentionally would have been enough. So the Torah is adding a few words, to slay him with guile. Okay, now, how do the witnesses know that he acted intentionally? It must be that they forewarned him and still he acts intentionally. Interesting, right? That it's not enough that the judges will sort of take into account what the witnesses saw and they decide whether it was intentional or not. Somehow the witnesses needed to know to be able to testify that it was intentional. How could they possibly know what the killer's intent was unless they told him, if you kill that person, you're going to be subject to the death penalty? And he said, I know, and he killed him anyway. Then for sure, we know it was intentional. How do the witnesses know that he acted intentionally? It must be that they forewarned him and he still acts intentionally. So the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught a source for the requirement to forewarn transgressors from the verse concerning the court-imposed capital punishment meted out to the woodgatherer on Shabbos in the wilderness, right? So when the Torah was first given, the laws of Shabbos were first given to the children of Israel, having come out of Egypt, now in the wilderness, on their way to the promised land, ended up being a long journey, not 1 year or 2 years, but 40 years because of the sin of the spies. We leave for another day. But when the laws of Shabbos were first given, they said, God said, under pain of death, you will all keep Shabbos. Now, this wasn't, where the modern world and, this vast number of Jews in the world, so sadly the majority of Jews in the world don't even know what the laws of Shabbos are. They wouldn't be violating them intentionally. Here you had all the children of Israel witness the miracles of the plagues of Egypt, witness the miracle of the parting of the Red Sea, witness the miracle of God's self appearing to the Jewish people and giving the commandments, and the Big Ten, shall we say, the 10 Commandments. Some people will say, well, I'm not so religious, but I keep the 10 Commandments. Really? Do you keep Shabbos? Because Shabbos is one of the 10 Commandments. All right? And so the laws came down, very visibly from God, who was also miraculously providing manna in the morning, water all day in the midst of the hot, scorching desert, and cool air conditioning, courtesy of the clouds of glory. All miracles. Under those conditions, I think all of us would keep Shabbos. Not that much is being asked of you. Nobody has to work. Nobody has to work for a living. There's not that much to keeping Shabbos. All God said is, and don't gather wood. Don't gather manna, which isn't even coming on Shabbos. Just sit, enjoy, talk Torah, talk about the events that are transpiring around you and all these miracles. Be appreciative. and don't violate Shabbos. And this woodgatherer went out and did it anyway. It was like he was making some kind of a point of being a heretic. And they said, well, what are we going to do? And Moses wasn't even sure. Like, okay, he's violating Shabbos. What should we do? And God said, execute him. Okay, so that's the conditions of this first execution for violating Shabbos. Now, in that circumstance, what happened? It is stated, and they that found him gathering sticks brought him. That's Numbers 15:33. Now, by writing gathering in the present tense, the verse indicates that they forewarned him, but he went on gathering. The school of Rebbe taught a source for the requirement to forewarn a transgressor from the verse. So now we've seen two different sources in the Torah for the requirement to forewarn a transgressor before he's executed or given lashes. One, right, was the case of incest, where he has to see that what he's doing is wrong. The other was the woodgatherer, who was warned that he was violating Shabbos in a punishable way. Now a third source. The school of Rebbe taught a source for the requirement to forewarn a transgressor from the verse concerning the court-imposed capital punishment meted out to one who commits adultery with a betrothed young woman. This is basically rape of a woman who is betrothed. So as it is stated for the matter, devar, that he has humbled his neighbor's wife, right? She's a betrothed young woman. She could have been, in other words, she was betrothed to a man by her father. The marriage may not happen for a year or many years, right? But she is already promised to that man by her father. This is why we're talking about a young woman and why I'm saying this is basically a rape, of a child. Obviously an adult woman could betroth herself, but this also could happen to a minor who was betrothed by her father to a man. She's betrothed, and later she can consummate that marriage. Okay, about this case where this man comes along and seduces that young girl, right? So what does it say about this? And that is a death penalty offense. So it says in Deuteronomy 22:24, for the matter, devar, right? The word devar can mean word or thing or matter, the matter. So for the devar, that he has humbled his neighbor's wife. Now, they make a verbal analogy for matters involving speech, right? Dibur, speech, like devar is word. This is the same root. So the punishment is given only if the witnesses issued a verbal warning. So the Gemara comments, and it is necessary to have all these sources, right? The case of incest, the case of the woodgatherer, and the case of this man who seduces the young betrothed woman. All these three cases are necessary to teach this law of forewarning. Why? Since if the merciful one would write the requirement of forewarning in the context of his sister, the incest case alone, I would say those liable to receive lashes, yes, they do require forewarning, but those liable to receive court-imposed capital punishments whose transgressions are severe do not require forewarning, right? Incest is not punishable by death in an earthly court, but this seduction of the young woman or violating Shabbos are. Therefore, the merciful one writes with regard to a murderer, if a man come intentionally. And if the merciful one would write only if a man come intentionally, I would say that this statement applies only when the penalty is death by the sword, as that is a lenient form of court-imposed capital punishment. But with regard to stoning, which is a severe form of court-imposed capital punishment, one could say that it does not require forewarning. Therefore, it is necessary to state the requirement of forewarning with regard to one who desecrates Shabbos. Right? That's how important Shabbos is. It's considered a more severe transgression than murder in certain kinds of analysis. Now, the Gemara asks, and why do I need two verses that state the requirement for forewarning in the context of those liable to be stoned? both the Shabbos violator and one who commits adultery with a betrothed young woman are punished with stoning. And the Gemara answers, according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, that death by burning is more severe than death by stoning. The additional verse serves to add the law that if a forewarning must be issued to those liable to be burned for their transgressions, another kind of death penalty, by way of the application of the principle, if this law is not needed for the matter in which it is written, apply it to a different matter. Basically, they're deriving that no matter what the severity is of the offense that leads to the death penalty, forewarning is required. You might have thought that for a crime that is severe enough, we're going to just execute him even without a forewarning. But here we're learning that, no, you need the forewarning in almost every case. The incitement to idolatry is one exception, forewarning not required. And there's a whole category of people that we're going to learn about in a moment who do not require forewarning even for these crimes. According to the opinion of the rabbis, that death by stoning is more severe than death by burning. One can say that even with a matter that can be derived through a kal v'chomer inference, the verse nevertheless takes the trouble and writes it explicitly. And the Gemara challenges, but let the merciful one write this law only in the context of those liable to be stoned, and let these others be derived from it, as stoning is the most severe punishment. And the Gemara answers, here too one can say that even with a matter that can be derived through a kal v'chomer inference, the verse nevertheless takes the trouble and writes it explicitly. We might have derived it by saying, if in such a in a more lenient, in a less severe, I'm going to move on. The point is, we are requiring the forewarning in all those cases. Now, new subject. The Brisa teaches that one of the questions the court asks of the witnesses is, right now we're getting back to the subject of our Mishnah that we're discussing is interrogations and examinations, how the witnesses are questioned. The forewarning was actually not the main topic. Now, the Brisa teaches that one of the questions that the court asks of the witnesses is, did he release himself to death? I.e., did he acknowledge that he is aware that the court imposes capital punishment for murder? Right? So this is one of the questions in the examination. The interrogation is really just about time and place. Where were you when you saw this crime committed? Examination is, what did you see? How did you see it? From where did you see it? What was he saying? What was he doing? What were other people saying and doing? What was he wearing? Right? All these kinds of questions. Now, with regard to this forewarning, that's what kind of interaction did you, the witness, have with the accused? Right? So here, if he forewarned him that that the crime he's about to commit would result in the death penalty, how do you know he heard you? How do you know he understood what you were saying? That's what's being asked here. Did he release himself to death means, did he acknowledge that he is aware that the court imposes capital punishment for the murder? So the Gemara asks, from where do we derive that he must release himself to death? Acknowledge that this is a death penalty offense that he's been warned about. Rava said, and some say it was Chizkiah who said. And the verse states, quote, by the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall the dead be put to death. What do you mean the dead? The accused, right? By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall the accused be put to death. Why does the Torah say shall the dead be put to death? By referring to the transgressor as dead even before he is executed, the verse indicates that he is not executed unless he releases himself to death by stating that he is aware that he will be executed for his transgression. Rav Hanan says, witnesses who testify to the adultery of a betrothed young woman who were rendered conspiring witnesses are not killed. Okay, this is getting a little complicated. So there's a man who's going to seduce this young woman who is betrothed to someone else. Okay, he's the criminal. If he is raping her, seducing her, she's not, liable. I mean, she hasn't done anything wrong. If she's young, but she's an adult, and she does this voluntarily with this man, okay, then she is committing adultery with this man. So she's also a transgressor. Okay, now there's two witnesses that are going to come and say, hey, we saw these two people, this man and this betrothed woman, have relations with each other. And we warn them that if they do that, they're going to, commit adultery and be liable to the death penalty. And they did it anyway. Now, what if these two witnesses are liars and they're just lying, right? She didn't. She was betrothed to someone else and she didn't sleep with this man. And the witnesses are liars. And we'd like to establish them as conspiring witnesses by bringing other witnesses who say, well, these guys who say that they saw that woman and that man sleep together in this place at this time, those witnesses couldn't have been there because they were with us somewhere else. Well, if you can prove that the witnesses are liars, that they are conspiring witnesses who are coming to have somebody, be penalized, possibly even executed in a trial, and you prove that they're conspiring witnesses, then they are going to be subject to that same punishment, as we've said a bunch of times. Now, this idea of conspiring witnesses and forewarning has an interesting intersection, as we see. So witnesses who testify to the adultery of a betrothed young woman who were rendered conspiring witnesses, they are not killed. Well, why not? If adultery is a death penalty offense and they're coming to have somebody accused of it falsely, that person stands to be executed, so the conspiring witnesses should be executed. Why would they not be executed? Although conspiring witnesses are generally punished with the same punishment they attempted to impose on the purported transgressor, which we learn in Deuteronomy 19:19, this set of circumstances is an exception. And this is because they, the false witnesses, can say, we did not come to testify in order to have her be executed. Rather, we came to forbid her to her husband. As a betrothed or married woman who willingly engages in adulterous sexual intercourse becomes forbidden to her husband. They have to divorce. He can't take her back if she voluntarily, intentionally committed sexual intercourse with another man, if she committed adultery. So the Gemara challenges this ruling, but they, meaning the witnesses, must testify that they forewarned her before her transgression for her to be subject to a death penalty. And forewarning includes apprising the transgressor of the punishment he or she will receive. So how can the witnesses claim that they did not intend this result? And the Gemara answers, Rav Hanan stated this law with regard to a case where they claim they did not forewarn her. So the Gemara asks, but if they claim they did not forewarn her, how can she be killed? If she would not have been killed, there is no novelty to Rav Hanan's statement that the witnesses are not killed. If she didn't stand to be executed, then they obviously could not be executed. So the Gemara explains, Rav Hanan stated this law with regard to a woman who is a chavera. What's a chavera? The female version of a chaver. What's a chaver? A chaver is a friend or a companion. But when the Talmud says a chaver, we're talking about like a friend of the sages, meaning somebody is well-versed in Torah law. So what's a chavera? A woman who is well-versed in Torah law. So a woman who is well-versed in Torah law knows that committing adultery is a death penalty offense. She doesn't have to be forewarned. And now we just see that there's a whole lot of people. Anyone who's well-versed in Torah law doesn't require forewarning in order to be executed by the court because they know that that crime is a death penalty offense. So, let's keep going here. Where's the chavera? Yes, so Rav Hanan stated this law with regard to a woman who is a chavera, knowledgeable in Torah, and it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Yehuda. As it is taught in a baraisa, the Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, says a chaver does not require forewarning in order to be liable for a transgression, because forewarning is given only in order to distinguish between an intentional and an unintentional act. It's not intentional if you don't know that this is forbidden, that you don't know if it's prohibited. And in fact, it's not considered intentional if you don't know, A, that it's prohibited, and B, what the penalty is, right? So if you don't know that, then even though you might think it's wrong to do, it's not an intentional transgression. But if you do know that it's prohibited and what the penalty is, and you do it anyway, then that's considered intentional. The Gemara asks further, but since the witnesses are not killed for their conspiratory testimony, in the case of a chavera, how can she be killed for her action? Their testimony is testimony that you cannot render conspiratory testimony, i.e., witnesses cannot be punished for their testimony, and any testimony that you cannot potentially render conspiratory testimony is not categorized as testimony at all, right? And this kind of speaks to what we were saying earlier, that the reason interrogations are so important, and if the witnesses disagree on any of the matters of the interrogation, meaning where were you and when were you there, if the two witnesses disagree on any of that, their testimony is dismissed immediately and the defendant walks. Why? Because if you can't establish where they were and when they were there, then there's no way to establish that their testimony was false as conspiratory witnesses, as conspiring witnesses, because that would depend on other witnesses coming and saying, no, at that time, they were in some other place, not where they claim to be. So that's why the interrogation is so important. Likewise, this principle, if there's no possibility of establishing these witnesses as conspiratory witnesses, then it's actually, they're not witnesses at all, right? And the reason you don't have that possibility is because they're not establishing when and where they were, or any other factor that would make it impossible for them to be rendered conspiratory witnesses, like these unusual circumstances. The Gemara answers, and that is also what he is saying. Since the witnesses are not killed because of these circumstances where they can say, yeah, we didn't come to have her executed by her testimony, we just came to have her rendered prohibited to her husband, sort of changing what the penalty is. Therefore, you cannot potentially render their testimony conspiratory. It's kind of weird because, like, what would their punishment be if they come to render her prohibited to her husband, to the husband, and then they're, found to be conspiring witnesses? What would their punishment be? Okay, they can't marry the husband either. I mean, right? So the Gemara challenges, but with regard to a woman who is a chavera, knowledgeable in Torah, since we maintain that she can be killed without being forewarned, how can you find this occurring according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Yehuda? As there was no forewarning, and there was no forewarning needed because she's a chavera, so the witnesses can claim that their intention was to forbid her to her husband. And the Gemara answers, it is found in a case where they testify that she committed adultery, and then they testified that she again committed adultery. So the witnesses cannot claim that their testimony was meant to forbid her to her husband, as she was already forbidden to him due to the first time that she committed adultery. What's going on here is we're getting in the weeds on purpose, right? These facts don't make sense in the real world, and they don't need to. The sages are here arguing about what exactly are the requirements of conspiring witnesses, what exactly are the requirements of forewarning, how do these intersect, and they're coming up with a somewhat outlandish set of circumstances just to test what exactly is the law and do we understand it. Right? So they're coming up now with even more extreme circumstances. The Gemara answers, it would be found in a case where they testify that she committed adultery, and she wasn't executed because we didn't have the forewarning, and then they testified that she again committed adultery. So the witnesses cannot claim that their testimony was meant to forbid her to her husband, as she was already forbidden to him due to the first time that she committed adultery. So the Gemara challenges this, but the witnesses can say, yeah, we came to forbid her to her second paramour. And the law is that in addition to becoming forbidden to her husband, an adulterous woman becomes forbidden to her paramour. And the witnesses can claim that this was their intent in testifying, not to render her, to have her executed. And that's why they should not be subject to execution. And the Gemara answers, it is found in a case where they testify that she again committed adultery with the first paramour, i.e. the second act was with the same paramour, to whom she was already forbidden. Or alternatively, it is found in a case where they testify that she committed adultery with one of her relatives, to whom she is forbidden regardless. And the Gemara clarifies what is different that Rav Chanan chose to state this law with regard to a betrothed young woman. His law could be stated with regard to a married woman as well. And the Gemara answers, yes, that is correct. But the novelty of this element of his ruling is that even with regard to this betrothed young woman who does not live under her husband, she's not married to him yet, she lives in her father's house, the witnesses can say, we came to forbid her from her husband, to her husband, that she could never, move from betrothal to marriage. That was really not easy and more about the technical requirements of forewarning. So we're going to move on. Rav Chisda said, in a case where one of the witnesses says, right, we're getting back to the judges examining the witnesses in court. In a case where one of the witnesses says, the murderer killed the victim with a sword, and one of the witnesses says, the murderer killed the victim with an ariran, which is another kind of weapon, this is not congruent testimony, as this is a clear contradiction. Right? If witnesses disagree on what was the murder weapon, we cannot convict the defendant based on their testimony because they're disagreeing on a key component of the crime. Therefore, this defendant is going to walk. But if one of the witnesses says the murderer's garments were black, and one of the witnesses says the murderer's garments were white, this is congruent testimony, as this is not a meaningful discrepancy. The Gemara objects from a Baraisa. The verse states with regard to testimony, quote, and behold, it be truth, the matter certain. Deuteronomy 17:4, right? You have to be certain before you execute. Now, the meaning of certain is that the testimony of the two witnesses must be congruent. If one witness says the murderer killed the victim with a sword, and the other one says the murderer killed the victim with an ariran, or if one of the witnesses says the murderer's garments were black and the other witness says the murderer's garments were white, this is not congruent testimony. This contradicts the ruling of Rav Chisda. So the Gemara answers, Rav Chisda interpreted that Baraisa as speaking about a scarf with which the murderer strangled the victim, as this is the same as the contradiction with regard to a sword versus an ariran. If the murder weapon was a scarf used to choke the victim, then yeah, the color matters. And if one says black, it was black, and the other says it was white, this is not congruent testimony. And the Gemara suggests coming here a proof from a Baraisa. If one of the witnesses says the sandals of the murderer were black, and one of the witnesses says the sandals of the murderer were white, this is not congruent testimony. This contradicts the ruling of Rav Chisda. And the Gemara answers, Rav Chisda can explain that there also, it is speaking of a case where the murderer kicked the victim with his sandal and killed him. So the shoe was essentially the murder weapon at the end of the foot that was delivering the kick. So then the color of the sandal that was on that shoe, that was on that foot, that kicked and killed the victim, yeah, the color of that shoe matters. So the Gemara suggests, come in here, proof from our Mishna. An incident occurred, and Ben Zakkai examined the witnesses about the stems of figs, indicating that even a contradiction concerning a minor point such as this would render the testimony incongruent. Sounds like it's not just the interrogation, place and time, that has to be exactly the same for the two witnesses, but even answers to other questions within the examinations need to be the same, or we're not going to execute, even on a minor matter like this, the stems of the figs. So what's going on? And the Gemara answers that Rami Bar Chama said, it is speaking there of a case where he picked a fig on Shabbos, as he is killed for that act itself. Picking a fruit from its source of growth is an example of the forbidden labor of reaping. So the testimony about the characteristics of the fig is significant. And the Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a Baraisa, when Ben Zakkai asked the witnesses the question about the stems of figs, they said to him, the murderer killed the victim beneath a fig tree, indicating that it was speaking of a murder case, not a Shabbos violator. So rather, Rami Bar Chama said the Mishnah is speaking of a case where the murderer stabbed the victim with a branch of a fig tree. As Rav Chizda himself ruled, a contradiction concerning details of the murder weapon renders the testimony incongruent. Come in here a proof, as in that same examination, Ben Zakkai said to the witnesses, "This fig tree, about which you are testifying, were its stems thin or were its stems thick? Were the figs on it black or were the figs on it white?" These questions concern the fruit itself, not the characteristics of a branch. So rather, Rav Yosef says, should a person raise a difficulty from the conduct of Ben Zakkai? Ben Zakkai is different, as he equated examinations with interrogations. According to Ben Zakkai's opinion, a contradiction in the witness's answers to an examination question is as significant as a contradiction in the witness's answers to an interrogation question about place and time. And it also renders the testimony incongruent, meaning this is a minority view. Ben Zakkai seems to be saying, the witnesses have to have congruent testimony both in interrogations and in examinations. But the Mishnah taught us that the majority view is inconsistency in the interrogations renders the witness testimony invalid. But inconsistency, at least on minor matters in the examinations, does not. The Gemara clarifies, who is Ben Zakkai mentioned in the Mishnah? If we say it is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the famous Ben Zakkai, was he a member in a Sanhedrin that judged capital cases? But isn't it taught in a Baraisa, all the years of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai were 120 years. He had a full, complete life. He lived to 120. For 40 of those years, he was a businessman. For 40 of those years, he studied and learned Torah, becoming a sage. And for 40 of those years, presumably from 80 to 120, he taught and guided the Jewish people. He was one of the leading sages of the nations. And of course, it was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai who negotiated with Vespasian, right, the Roman general who was sent to sack Jerusalem at the end of the Second Temple period. That was the end. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was able to, it's a wonderful, beautiful, colorful story, how he got out of Jerusalem, negotiated with this general, told him, you're going to be the emperor. And he was right. And then Vespasian said, what can I do for you? And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, give me Yavne and its sages. Meaning, these people who are leading the rebellion against Rome, they're zealots, they're misguided, they're going to bring a tragedy on the Jewish people. We know that the reason that the temple is falling, that Jerusalem is falling, is because of our sins. But we haven't abandoned God, and we know God is not going to abandon us. So let the religious leadership, right, the Sanhedrin, leave Jerusalem and reestablish itself in the little town of Yavne. And Vespasian agreed, right? Agreed. And it was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai who really kind of presided over, along with Rabban Gamliel, who he asked for. Also, give me Yavne and its sages, give me Rabban Gamliel, who was the Nasi at that time. And they presided over this, kind of unbelievable, nearly miraculous transformation, or not really transformation, but adaptation, right? Adaptation of holy temple-based Torah Judaism. What was Judaism going to look like after the temple was destroyed, right? And it's remained destroyed for 2,000 years. Judaism and the Jewish people as a distinct people could have perished from this world. But they set us on a course, right, where prayer replaced the sacrifices, and where we would organize communities both in the land of Israel and in the diaspora that would preserve Torah and keep the Jewish people alive and well and under God's wings on into the future. That's Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was present, as it's obvious from that story, at the destruction of the Second Temple. Okay, so what's the problem? There was a Sanhedrin before the temple was destroyed, and thanks to his efforts, there was a Sanhedrin after the temple was destroyed. So what's the problem? The Gemara continues its question. And it is taught in a baraisa, where the question being asked is, did he sit on a Sanhedrin that judged capital cases? Why wouldn't he? Let's keep reading. And it is taught in a baraisa, 40 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, the Sanhedrin was exiled from the chamber of hewn stone on the Temple Mount, and instead it sat in the store near the Temple Mount. And Rabbi Yitzhak bar Abudimi says, the intent of the statement concerning the relocation of the Sanhedrin is to say that they no longer judge laws of fines. The Gemara asks, does it enter your mind to say that they no longer judge laws of fines? It is known that the Sanhedrin would judge laws of fines for hundreds of years after the destruction of the temple. Rather, he must have said that the Sanhedrin no longer judged cases of capital law. Once the Sanhedrin left the chamber of hewn stone, the court's power to judge capital cases was nullified. Because after all, no longer was Israel, one nation under Torah, right, with its own king. Rather, it was a province of Rome. Rome was exerting its authority there. Rome was establishing courts of law. And that's where murder cases were being tried. And Rome didn't want some other courts judging capital cases like that. Or prohibited it under pain of death. And Rabbi Yitzhak bar Abudimi says, the intent of the statement concerning the relocation of the Sanhedrin is to say that they no longer, it was capital law. So the court's power to judge capital cases was nullified 40 years before the Second Temple was destroyed. So the Gemara concludes its question. And since we learned in a Mishna, Tractate Sukkah 41a, once the temple was destroyed, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted an ordinance that the mitzvah of lulav should be performed even in the rest of the country for 7 days in commemoration of the temple, in memory of the temple. So it is clear that he was in a position of prominence after the destruction of the temple. Since the Sanhedrin ceased judging cases of capital law 40 years before the destruction of the temple, and Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was in a position of prominence for only 40 years, he could not have been a judge in a capital case. And the Gemara suggests rather one can say that it was merely a different person named Ben Zakkai, not the well-known sage of that name. And so too it is reasonable to say this, as if it enters your mind that this was Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, would Rebbe call him Ben Zakkai without any title? He must have been referring to someone else, because Rebbe would have called Yochanan ben Zakkai Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Wouldn't have just called him Ben Zakkai the way you would talk to a student. So the Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a Barais explicitly? An incident occurred and Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai examined the witnesses with regard to the stems of figs. This is how we started this. This proves that the sage in question is Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and rather one can say that at that time when this incident occurred, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was a student sitting before his teacher. And in those years, the Sanhedrin was in its place and judged cases of capital law. And he said a matter in the course of examining the witnesses, and his reasoning was logical to them. So the judges asked his question and elevated him right up to the benches of the judges. During that case, he didn't become a sage yet, but he was taken seriously even while he was a student. And his questions in that case were recorded in the Gemara, even though he didn't have smicha yet, he was not ordained as a sage yet. Now we're on page 41b. This page is a little shorter than the previous. And Rebbe established it in the Mishnah in his name. And when he was studying, they called him Ben Zakkai in the manner that they would call a student sitting before his teacher. And when he was teaching others, they called him Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. In terms of the Barais in the Mishnah, when they called him Ben Zakkai in the Mishnah, that was based on the name that he was called initially when he was a student. And when they called him Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai in another Baraisa, that was based on the name that he was called, later when he became a sage. New subject. The Mishnah teaches an incident occurred, and Ben Zakkai examined the witnesses about the stems of figs. What is the difference between interrogations and examinations? In the case of interrogations, if one of the witnesses says, I do not know the answer, their testimony is void immediately. In the case of examinations, if one says, I do not know the answer, and even if two witnesses say, we do not know the answer, their testimony still stands, right? About place and time, you need to know the answer, and the two witnesses need to agree. About, what was he wearing? What was the person standing behind the victim wearing? If they disagree or they don't know, that's not going to render the testimony void immediately. They can have either ignorance or disagreement on small matters in the examinations, but they can't have ignorance or any disagreement on the matters of the interrogations. The Gemara asks, what is the meaning of even if two say? Isn't it obvious? The Mishna already stated that when one witness says, I don't know, their testimony stands, indicating that knowledge of the answers to these types of questions is not required. Accordingly, when two witnesses say that they do not know, their testimony stands as well. What is the novelty of this ruling? And Rav Sheshis said this clause is referring to the first clause of the Mishnah. And this is what it is saying. With regard to the interrogations, even if two witnesses say, we know, and one additional witness says, I don't know, their testimony is void. In accordance with whose opinion is this Mishnah written? In accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who compares in all court proceedings 3 witnesses to 2, holding that just as 2 witnesses must testify a fully valid testimony, so it is with 3. You only need 2. But if you bring 3 witnesses, then they still have to agree with each other on the interrogations. It's not going to be okay that you bring 3 witnesses and 2 agree, 1 doesn't, so you could just say, well, dismiss that 3rd witness, and then we have 2 witnesses who agree. Since you brought 3, they have to all agree on the questions of the interrogations, or the case is dismissed, according to Rabbi Akiva. Rava says, but the Mishnah teaches their testimony stands, not their testimony is void. So rather, Rava said, this is what the Mishnah is saying. Even with regard to the interrogations, if 2 witnesses say, we know, and 1 witness says, I don't know, their testimony stands, as the court accepts the testimony of the 2. In accordance with whose opinion is this Mishnah written? Clearly not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. So the Gemara relates, Rav Kahana and Rav Safra studied tractate Sanhedrin in the school of Rabban. Rami Bar Chama encountered them. Rami Bar Chama said to them, what do you say concerning tractate Sanhedrin that you learned in the school of Rabban? And Rav Kahana and Rav Safra said to him, and what do we say concerning the regular tractate Sanhedrin? And what is difficult for you? Do you have a specific difficulty that you would like answered? So Rami Bar Chama said to them, I have a difficulty from that which is taught in the Mishnah. What is the difference between interrogations and examinations? In the case of interrogations, if one of the witnesses says, I do not know the answer, their testimony is void immediately. In the case of examinations, if one says, I do not know the answer, and even if 2 say, we do not know the answer, their testimony still stands. So now Rami Bar Chama asks this question. After all, this type of question and that type of question are required by Torah law, interrogations and examinations. What is different about interrogations and what is different about examinations? Why is there a difference in halacha between the 2? Rav Kahana and Rav Safra said to him, how can these cases be compared? With regard to the interrogations, if one witness says, I do not know, their testimony is void, as it is testimony that you cannot render conspiratory testimony. If they don't know the place and time where they were standing when they are claiming that they saw the defendant commit a crime, then we can never challenge those witnesses as conspiring witnesses, because the only way to do that is to bring other witnesses who say, at that time, these people who claim to be witnesses were not in that place. They were with us somewhere else. If they don't establish the place and time, we can't bring such a challenge. And if we don't have the possibility of bringing such a challenge, we're not going to allow the testimony at all, since it cannot be tested. If the witnesses do not state a specific time and place, there is no way for other witnesses to claim that the first witnesses had been with them elsewhere at the time they claimed the event occurred. By contrast, with regard to the examinations, if one of the witnesses says, I do not know, their testimony stands, as it is testimony that you can still render conspiratory testimony, because what they don't know about has nothing to do with the place and time. Rami Bar Chama said to them, if you said an incisive statement like this about this tractate, you said much about it. He's complimenting them. Rav Kahana and Rav Safra said to him, due to the master's goodness, that is, due to your goodwill and desire to accept our answer to your question, we said much about it. But with the master's rebuke and challenge, we would not say even one answer about it, i.e., if you had wished to criticize this answer, you could have refuted it, and it would be as if we did not say any answer. They're saying, we might have learned something in that school, but you are our superior, and, we would defer to you because you know a lot more than us. We just happen to know something that you might not have heard before. New subject, and I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Mishna teaches that if one witness says the event occurred on the 2nd of the month and one witness says that the event occurred on the 3rd of the month, their testimony stands, since it is possible to say that the reason there was a discrepancy in the date is that one of the witnesses did not hear that the Sanhedrin had intercalated the previous month, added a day to it, right? Because they didn't see, the witnesses didn't come with testimony about the new moon, and so they made it a full month, right? A month with 30 days instead of 29. And the other witness hadn't heard that. And so they were speaking truthfully about their knowledge of the date, but they hadn't heard what the status of the calendar was. We no longer have that because the Sanhedrin doesn't declare when a new month begins by hearing testimony about the moon. The calendar has been fixed and, mathematically calculated for 1,000 years. But before that, that's how it could happen. The Gemara asks, until how many days into the month does the court assume that one of the witnesses does not know when the month began? And Rabbi Acha Bar Chanina says that Rabbi Asi says that Rabbi Yochanan says until the majority of the month has passed. Once we're past the halfway point of the month, past the full moon, it's enough time that all people would have heard, whether the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem had declared the previous month full or not. People will know what the date is. Rava says, we learned this in the Mishna as well, as it teaches, if one witness says that the event occurred on the 3rd of the month, and one witness says that the event occurred on the 5th of the month, their testimony is void. Not a one-day discrepancy, but a 2-day discrepancy. But why is it void? Let us say that it is not a contradiction, as this witness knows of 2 additions, i.e. that a day was added not just to this past month, but also the month before that. And the other witness hadn't heard about the addition, neither to the previous month nor the month before that. So rather, is it not void because once the majority of the month passed, a witness does know what day it is, so that an error of 2 days would not occur. In other words, you're not going to find a witness who's unaware that not only one month had been added a day to it, but the 2 previous months. He would have heard at least about one of those months, because by the time the majority of the month has passed, everyone has heard about it. And the Gemara rejects this as a proof. Actually, I could say to you that a witness may not know the day even once the majority of the month has passed. And the reason for the ruling of the Mishnah is that he knows about the shofar, which the court would blow at the new moon. It's possible that with regard to one blast of the shofar, it could be said that he erred and was not aware of it. With regard to 2 blasts of the shofar, it cannot be said that he erred that much. By contrast, in the case of the Mishnah here, perhaps as long as the witnesses are testifying about 2 consecutive days within 1 month, the error of one of them persisted throughout the month, and he might have still been making that error, by the 17th or 18th day of the month. So have we proven that this 1-day discrepancy is only permitted in the first half of the month or not? Doesn't seem so. We'll continue this discussion on Wednesday. No class Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, because I'm traveling, and we will gather again on Wednesday, God willing, at the regular time. Okay, just time for a couple of questions. Renee, guile as a substitute term for what we now refer to as the mens rea, specific intent in jurisprudence. I remember that from law school. Thank you. Bill, what if those witnesses were accused of conspiring against the woman who defend themselves saying that they only intended her to be separated from her husband rather than to be executed, claim that they did forewarn her, but only about the separation and didn't mention the death penalty aspect? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think it was just I was very confused in terms of why it doesn't work. The main thing is that they can't be conspiring witnesses with respect to the death penalty, because they claim that that's not what they were trying to create. Then they could be rendered conspiring witnesses with respect to okay, they're not going to succeed in prohibiting her to her husband. But what would the punishment be? Since there is no equivalent punishment for them, maybe conspiring witness is just off the table for that reason, at least as a technical matter, renders it difficult. But I feel like you asked a good question and I'm unable to give you a good answer, and I apologize. And finally, Marjorie, I do not worry about catching up. Learning is important. Hashem's timing is perfect. We will finish. Accidental Talmudist is a blessing to me, my family, and some friends who check in. Thank you so much, Marjorie. Thank you, all of you. I love learning with you, and I look forward to doing it again come Wednesday. May everybody be blessed with a sweet, illuminating, uplifting, refreshing Shabbos. May we hear only good news going into Shabbos and coming out of Shabbos. We say Amen. All the best.